recording. So we are recording this session. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. My name is Taylor Smith-Hams. I use she, her pronouns. I am an organizer with 350.org, which is a global climate justice organization. And we are supporting legislation like this around the country to make hold utilities accountable. And so we've got some great speakers this evening. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here. So just some quick, I'm just getting clear. Okay, great. So just some quick logistics. Please put your questions in the chat. We will get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A at the end after we get through the presentations. And we will be sharing this recording and the slides and other links and resources in a follow-up email. So you will get those resources. Great. So today we are going to talk about what utility accountability is and why it matters. We'll do an overview of utility accountability legislation in New York, the local landscape, and then how to get involved in this campaign, how to support this legislation, and then we'll do the Q&A. And we have three amazing speakers who are going to talk to us this evening. So I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker. Itai Vardi is a research manager at the Energy and Policy Institute, which is a utility and fossil fuel industries watchdog group that exposes attacks on clean energy. So take it away, Itai.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Welcome, everyone. I'll just start by giving a brief overview and contextualizing this particular piece of legislation in New York and place it into a broader picture for you all. So what really is utility accountability legislation and why it matters? And I can say that the need for this kind of legislation that will prohibit utilities from using ratepayer monies for various political activities and unnecessarily extravagant costs became heightened a few years ago, following a number of high-profile scandals that rocked the utility world. Some of you might have heard, for example, the scandal of First Energy in Ohio that turned out used ratepayer money to fund a broad range political influence campaign to bail out its failing coal and nuclear plants. That even involved illegal activities of bribing elected officials in Ohio. And there are several other, again, high-profile scandals in the utility world, including one in Florida. And so the need to stop utilities from using the money that they take from ratepayers to fund these kind of political activities became accentuated. And so this is the broader context where we find ourselves. And so it's essentially the point of this kind of legislation is to stop utilities from using our money for these kinds of activities because they ultimately serve their agendas and don't serve the ratepayers' interest. And these activities include some of the next bullet points, please. Various forms of lobbying, contributions that utilities provide to industry trade associations, like the American Gas Association, which has a long documented history of fighting electrification, sensible climate policies, and even energy efficiencies. Right now, as we speak, for example, AGA is taking the Department of Energy to court over its energy efficiency furnace rules. That's what they're doing. And their utilities use ratepayer money in many states to fund their membership in AGA. Next bullet point, please. Another example of what utilities do with ratepayer money is contribute to industry front groups. So almost every state has, this kind of grassroots sounding group. New York was for affordable energy, Coloradans for energy access. Just two real examples. And utilities are members of these groups. Next, please. Utilities use a lot of the money that they collect from ratepayers for advertising, image boosting advertising that just seeks to enhance their image and their public relation interest. Next, please. And as I mentioned, it's not only political activities, but just unnecessary costs that serve the shareholders of the company and not the ratepayers. So board of directors perks. Hundreds of $1,000s go on travel, meals, beverages, gifts to these directors. Next, please. And each utility also has what's called as investor relations unit. Those again serve primarily the interests of shareholders and not ratepayers. Next slide, please. And this is from our website. We'll provide a link to that in the chat, where we have a tracker of these kinds of bills throughout the country. You can see it's fairly widespread geographically as well. And notice also not only blue states have these bills. Utah, Ohio have such bills. Just this session, Oregon, Utah, and you can see there our neighbor to the north of us, Massachusetts, introduced these kinds of bills. I'm highlighting Massachusetts. It's important to note because Massachusetts shares a couple of New York's utilities. So Avangrid, NYSEG in New York, also operates in Massachusetts. And National Grid, of course, also operates in Massachusetts. So think about it. If that bill that is now under consideration in Massachusetts passes, our counterpart ratepayers of those same utilities will be exempt from funding these activities, while New York, if it doesn't pass this bill, will continue to pay those costs, which is just unfair. It's a matter of equity. Next slide, please. And another important point that I want to raise with you all, 3 states already passed these bills in late 2023. Colorado, Maine, another one of the Northeast neighbors, and Connecticut, another neighboring state that also shares some of the utilities. Avangrid operates in Connecticut as well. And so we already have a certain benchmark. A year and a half passed since these 3 states, Colorado, Maine, and Connecticut, passed these bills, and we can already show a savings for these ratepayers from the passage of these bills. They don't have to pay these political and extravagant, unnecessary costs anymore. Just one example on the left, the image on the left is a recent article in Colorado media on Xcel Energy. Even though the bill passed again in late 2023, the utilities still try to recover from ratepayers some of these prohibited costs. The PUC there said, no, you cannot do that. A total of $750,000 that without this bill, ratepayers would have had to pay. And on the right, you can see, I just recently calculated in the past little less than a year and a half, so since June 2023 to October 2024, Connecticut ratepayers save up to $8.9 million, costs that they would have had to pay if not for that new law. And just if you can see that came out a little small, here's one example from the disclosure reports that the utilities have to file annually with the PUC in Connecticut, showing how much money they spent on these prohibited costs. You can see here it's corporate aircraft costs. So it's a total of $163,000 just on corporate aircraft costs that now Connecticut's ratepayers don't have to pay. So these are the points I want to share with you, just some context of these bills throughout the country, what they do, and the important cost savings that they offer. and I'll hand it over back to Taylor.
Thanks so much, Itai. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anshul Gupta, the Policy and Research Director at New Yorkers for Clean Power and a Senior Research Scientist at IBM TJ Watson Research Center.
Thank you, Taylor. Could we move to the next slide?
1 second, sorry. All right, great.
Thanks. So I'll share some examples of what the gas utilities in New York are up to undermine the state's climate law as well as energy affordability in the state. This slide shows images from some of the PR campaigns by the American Gas Association using social media ads and hired influencers on Instagram to promote cooking with gas. AGA is a gas industry trade association that gas utilities support with their membership fees, as Itai mentioned before. The next slide, please. So now moving on to the role of individual utilities a bit. National Fuel Gas was found to be lobbying the Climate Action Council staff when they were developing the scoping plan, while the president of National Fuel Gas was actually a member of the Climate Action Council. And at the top right, you see that National Fuel was again caught using its access to its customers for a robocalling campaign against building electrification. The bottom right, you see that this utility continues its disinformation and fear-mongering campaigns to stall the bills like New York Heat in the state assembly, despite being chastised by the PSC before. And this also shows the need for bills like this, because what the PSC can or does currently isn't obviously sufficient to stop these utilities. Next slide, please. The top left of this slide shows that in July 2022, National Grid published an op-ed in Crain's New York Business promoting false solutions like RNG and hydrogen for home heating. In that op-ed, they erroneously wrote that hydrogen is produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. Then a month later, an op-ed appeared in Newsday from Riverhead Chamber of Commerce that said that hydrogen is produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. Then 1 month later, in Albany Times Union, another op-ed appeared, this time by the Capital Region Chamber, and that you can see at the top right. And guess what? It also said that hydrogen is produced by separating hydrogen out of the water molecule, leaving only water vapor behind. So National Grid isn't just running its own misinformation campaigns, but is also recruiting business partners to do the same on its behalf, all with ratepayer money. Next slide, please. Switching gears to energy affordability and energy burdens in New York State a bit. The chart on the left shows that our heating bills have been going up in the recent years. This is Con Edison. This applies to Con Edison, but it's true for all other utilities as well. And it's mostly being driven by delivery charges. The chart on the right, for example, shows that the gas supply prices are actually at historic lows. In spite of that, we are all observing that our heating bills are going up. Next slide, please. So in 2023, in New York State, 369,000 low-income customers were behind in their utility bill payments. Out of those, 46,000 were disconnected. 1.5 million households in the state participated in some form of energy assistance program. And over $400 million in unpaid bills were essentially the cost of that was shouldered by the remaining ratepayers. Next slide, please. So the point I want to make is that it's bad enough that the ratepayers are funding the utilities anti-climate and anti-consumer propaganda, but that's only a small part of the cost of the ratepayers. The ratepayers are also shouldering a much bigger burden from the regulatory and legislative capture by the utilities that they're able to sort of do from these other ratepayer-funded nefarious activities. Uh, so, for example, the gas utilities have managed to delay the passage of the New York Heat Act in the Assembly, which is costing ratepayers dearly. The New York Heat Act would help reduce those exorbitant delivery costs that I mentioned earlier, those delivery charges in the future by preventing wasteful investments in the gas infrastructure. And the bill will also directly address energy affordability. And we I showed earlier, we have an energy affordability crisis in the state that New York Heat Act will sort of address. But that will happen only if the Assembly is able to overcome the utilities lobbying and propaganda. Uh, yeah, with that, I will pass it back to Taylor.
Thank you so much, Anshul. And thank you all so much for your questions. Please keep putting them in the chat and we will get to them at the Q&A. So our last speaker is Hillary Aidun, a senior associate attorney at Earthjustice, where she works on decarbonizing the building sector, enforcing New York's climate law, and advancing environmental justice in the Northeast region.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you all for joining us. It's really exciting to see that there's so much interest in this issue, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to be here with us. So could we go back one slide? Perfect. So I work at Earthjustice, which is a nonprofit legal organization, and our involvement with this issue is that we have represented a number of groups in utility rate cases in New York. And these are rate cases where the Public Service Commission, which regulates gas and electric utilities, decides how much ratepayer money utilities are allowed to spend and on what. And so I saw a question in the chat about where do utilities get their money, if not from ratepayers. If there are costs that the utility has that the Public Service Commission determines should not be paid for by ratepayers, those costs are paid for by the utility's shareholders. And so just to zoom out and provide some of that context. And so New York law does already have some parameters. Under New York law, utilities are not allowed to use ratepayer money to directly lobby members of the state legislature. And they also can't use ratepayer money to pay trade association dues to organizations that do that kind of lobbying. So that's good. However, in participating in these rate cases, we have found that utilities are using a lot of ratepayer money for activities that we view as improper. And activities that advance their own interests and don't serve ratepayer interests. And just to give some examples, some of these activities include testifying against a local bill to ban fossil fuel combustion in new buildings, and that was in New York City, or submitting comments to state agencies on New York's climate scoping plan, which is a blueprint for how New York is going to meet the greenhouse gas reduction requirements of our climate law, and also submitting comments on regulations to implement that law, as well as emailing customers about how to comment on a long-term gas plan that was pending before the Public Service Commission. And these types of activities should not be paid for by ratepayers. And the Public Service Commission has taken some steps. They've recently required a utility to go back and review employees' time to see if they were spending time on advocacy that hadn't been tracked, and then to refund customers as needed based on that review, and that's good. But there is still a need for a legislative fix to fill a lot of gaps, because most of this activity that we have uncovered and we have shown to the Public Service Commission, look, this is what utilities are spending ratepayers' money on, the Public Service Commission has said that's okay. That's an appropriate use of ratepayer money. And we disagree. So let's go to the next slide. So that's why, exactly. So that's why it's important for us to have legislation to close some of these gaps. And so there are a few really important goals that the legislation needs to meet. One is providing transparency into how utilities use ratepayer money. It shouldn't be on us participating in these rate cases to uncover how the money is being used, what's paid for by ratepayers versus shareholders. So it's important for legislation to require that utilities publicly report on their marketing and political activity and clarify who's paying for that. And then we need to codify and clarify prohibitions on spending ratepayer money on political activity. So clarifying that utilities can't use ratepayer money for lobbying local governments, for lobbying state agencies, or for advertising that promotes their policy preferences, like pro-gas policies. And then, of course, it's important to require the Public Service Commission to track and regulate the use of ratepayer money based on that reporting, and to enforce the law and to impose penalties when utilities don't comply. So we are very grateful to State Senator Brook and Assemblymember Szilagyi for introducing this bill, which the name of it or the bill number is here on the slides. And we're really excited that they are interested in this issue. And we're also advocating for strengthening some language to make sure that all of the loopholes are closed and that ratepayers are protected. So back to you, Taylor.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Yeah, and so there are a couple quick ways that you can get involved in supporting this legislation. So as individuals, you all can use this action alert to email your legislators and ask them to support this bill. If you are part of an organization, you can join the coalition and endorse the bill by filling out that Google form that I just put in the chat. And so now we can move into Q&A. And I've been tracking what some folks have been putting in there. So I will just read them out, and then I will just, invite folks to respond. Okay, great. So Edward asks, why does the CEO of Con Edison get millions in salary and perks when he is bleeding customers? Anyone can take that. I think it's self-explanatory based on the conversation, but if anyone wants to respond.
I think the PSPSC is sort of they just started this looking into executive compensation and its impact on the bills. But I think the impact of the compensation on the bills is relatively small. It's what the utilities are doing in the sort of misinformation and propaganda space that ends up costing customers more in the long run.
Thanks, Anshul. So Sean asks, aren't utilities required to have their expense base approved by regulators versus just the amount of cost markup they are allowed to charge?
So yes, the Public Service Commission has to approve any rate hike that a utility wants to do. And the utility has to say, here are all the things that we have been spending money on, here are all the things that we plan to spend money on. And the Public Service Commission has to approve that. And so that's why we've been bringing some of these concerns to the Public Service Commission, but we've also seen that the Public Service Commission is failing to hold utilities accountable on some of these issues. And that's why we need legislation to make sure that the Public Service Commission is held accountable to enforcing the law and protecting ratepayers against these improper charges. Does that answer the question?
It does. It does. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. So Terry asks, And I think, Hillary, you already answered this a bit, but maybe just make sure. From a business perspective, how are utilities to cover these other costs when they aren't covered by ratepayers? I like the concept, but don't understand where the funds would come from.
Yeah, so the short answer is that the funding comes from the utilities shareholders. And that, the utilities have they have a right to say certain things, but that doesn't mean that they have a right to charge ratepayers for all of that activity, and they can pay for it themselves, meaning that the shareholders bear those costs.
Yeah. I would add that any capital investment that the utilities do, they usually have a 9 to 10% guaranteed rate of return on that. So they're making plenty of money. And if these costs don't come from ratepayers, they're going to come from those hefty profits that they're making, which we believe is the fair thing to happen.
Utilities also at times have non-regulated sources of income that can be a source to fund these types of costs as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a common reframe that we're seeing from utilities as they try to push back against these kind of laws in various states is that this is essentially an issue of free speech, First Amendment, and these kind of prohibitions, hurt their free speech rights. So that's really propaganda. No one is telling them not to engage in lobbying, advertising, or anything else that they really want to do. The point is use your shareholder money for that if you like, and not your ratepayers' money.
Thanks, Itai. So Jonathan asks, how is the PUC in New York? And does your org ever get involved in the elections? And I'm not sure which org you are referring to, but we can start first with how is the PUC in New York?
Well, I think I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but as I said, we've seen the Public Service Commission take some steps, not enough in our view, and again, that's why we see the need for a legislative fix here.
Great. And Kate asks, how can individuals get involved in rate cases? I saw Con Ed recently proposed 10% rate increases with hikes beginning in 2025, but I've been unable to find the rate case docket. Can Con Ed customers testify?
I love this question. Yes. Individuals have every right to get involved, and you should, because it's really important. So there are a couple things you can do. There's always the option to submit public comments. And I can drop the docket in the chat after this to show you where to do that. You can also appear at a public hearing to voice your opinions about Con Ed's proposal. And those are pretty easy ways to get involved. And then there's also the option to become a party to a rate case, which is a lot more involved, and parties often will submit testimony and participate in settlement negotiations, which can last for several months, and then have the opportunity to weigh in on whether they support or oppose any settlement that is reached. And that is a more involved process that is also available to individuals. So I'll put the docket in the chat so you all can see what the options are.
Thanks, Hillary. That's a really great question, Kate. All right, Roberta asks, why are we now seeing the cost of delivery going up?
I think the cost of delivery comes from maintenance of the infrastructure, distribution infrastructure, and from new investments in the infrastructure. So on the electric side, our sort of grid is fairly old, and there is a need to make some investments to make it more resilient, and sort of upgrade it. On the gas side, a lot of new investments we believe are wasteful because it costs on an average in the state $6 million per mile to replace old leaking pipe with new pipes. And these new pipes will have a physical life of 80 to 100 years, which they're never going to be used for. So it's really wasteful uh, sort of spending that the ratepayers are funding. The utilities love that because they make, once again, 9 to 10% profits on these investments. Um, and we believe that all ratepayers will, in the future, save money if we could avoid these investments in the gas infrastructure and move to non-pipe alternatives.
Thanks, Anshul. Billy asks, we already have an anti-lobbying contract with PSEG, yet it uses AstroTurf orgs and the Edison Institute to push its agenda. How can we stop them? And maybe, Itai, if you take that, or whoever takes that, if you want to also explain what AstroTurf organizations are.
Yeah, I mentioned briefly front groups. Those are groups that are created by industry companies and various other stakeholders that have, business interests and present themselves as a grassroots group, groups that speak for some broader public interest, while in essence it masks the fact that it is just promoting the narrow business economic interest. Um, and so that is something that's important for us to, I think, address in this particular bill to make sure that as Hillary mentioned, the definition or understanding of lobbying is expansive and goes beyond the current prohibition in New York law that focuses just on legislative lobbying and expands it to other forms of lobbying like grassroots lobbying and lobbying also beyond just the legislative level to other forms of, agency lobbying, administrative, executive lobbying, or, lobbying of quasi-governmental bodies like the Climate Action Council in New York. So that's the point again to expand or to cover and prohibit the various ways that utilities use lobbying or lobbying by proxy through other groups to get their way.
Thanks, Itai. And we've got a question from Laura about where to find phone and email for our legislators. I can put a link in the chat for that. And Joanna asks, New York State has been so dismal about taking necessary steps to meet CAC's recommendations on how to meet our CLCPA mandates. They flaunt the law. How can we hold them more accountable? And whoever takes that, please also spell out those acronyms so everyone understands.
I can start. So the CAC is the Climate Action Council, which spent a couple of years developing a scoping plan, which is sort of like a roadmap for how the state is going to implement the CLCPA, which is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The CLCPA was enacted in 2019. It requires the state to very steeply reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 85% by 2050. And to 40% by 2030, and also to promulgate regulations to make sure that those targets are met. And so I think, as we heard earlier, in terms of making sure that the Public Service Commission is reducing greenhouse gas emissions within its domain, which is the gas distribution system that serves buildings and other processes. The New York Heat Act is an important piece of that puzzle. And that's one of the laws that you heard about earlier. And I'll see if Anshul has anything to add, or Itai.
Yeah, I think I just add the dragging of the feet on, the implementation of many of the CAC's rules is just one, stark example of the outsized political power that utilities wield in New York. And ultimately, this, can be one of the major outcomes of a bill like this if it passes, that, saying to utilities, you can do whatever you want with your money. No one's telling you not to do these things. Just don't do it with our money. That's in principle wrong, because again, they're using ratepayer money. They're using a portion of your bill to advance their interests and not broader public interests.
And I would add that it's common in right-leaning media, and the utilities also try to push this narrative that implementing the climate law is what's causing our utility bills to go up. But New York Heat Act is actually an example where not implementing the climate law is increasing our utility bills. Recently, the legislature has uh, uh, hearings on the New York State budget, in which the chairman of the Public Service Commission explicitly, in his testimony explicitly said that one of the big drivers of the rate increases is that we are being forced to simultaneously invest in the energy system of the future, which is the electrical system, as well as the energy system of the past, which is the gas-based system, and it will save New Yorkers billions of dollars if we just focused on the future. And New York Heat Act will amend the public service law that actually forces us to continue to invest in the energy systems of the past.
Thanks, Anshul. All right, and Mags asks, does anyone know or know where we can find the data on how much Con Ed, for example, is spending on electric versus gas infrastructure? Con Ed is justifying a delivery increase on the need to integrate clean energy, which is a joke, as we know, as they haven't bought clean energy.
So the way that rate cases are very complicated, and the way that they work for utilities like Con Ed that have both gas and electric service is that it's technically two cases that are kind of happening together. And so if you were to look through everything that Con Ed filed with its proposal, there would be information about what is proposed for spending on the gas system versus the electric system. I think I saw that Lisa is pulling together information on that, which is great because it is a lot of information to sift through. And so that is a great public service. And I would recommend that folks keep their eyes peeled for that.
Thanks, Hillary. All right. And then there is another question here from Jonathan. I don't know if anyone here can answer this. I can certainly jump in. But DSA has proposed taking public ownership of the utilities. How would that work in practice? Do you ever see it happening?
So there's a push in Rochester also to sort of make their gas and electric utility public. It's I mean these sort of these initiatives face a lot of opposition, of course, from the for-profit utilities for obvious reasons, and they try to piggyback on the general sort of distrust of the government and sort of use that to successfully push back on making the utilities public. It seems to be it could be succeeding in Long Island. I'm not sure what the final status is, but I mean, my personal opinion is that would be a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. Having more public ownership and less corporate control over basic needs like energy is something that 350.org and certainly supports. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and we are going to wrap. But before you leave, yes, please fill out that action alert to tell your legislators to support this legislation. And if you are part of an organization and you would like to sign on your organization and support, you can fill out this Google form. Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. So we will send out the slides, the recording for this, and these links as well. And thank you all so much for your engagement, all of your great questions, for participating, and for your time tonight. And we look forward to working with you all to pass this bill this session. Thank you all so much.